Elias Boone's life was a circle of silence. Wake up, cook oats, sharpen the axe, walk into the timber. 2 winters he'd lived this way, ever since the quiet sickness took his wife, Sarah. The work was his only companion. The cabin, set deep in the woods, kept the talkative world at a distance, and he liked it that way. He was a man of wood and steel, not words. Solitude was how he stayed whole. This afternoon he'd climbed higher than usual, up the ridge where last month's storm had split the spruces clean open. He loaded his crate with stove lengths and kindling, the weight a familiar ache across his shoulders. The mission was simple, same as always: get enough fuel to outlast the winter. The forest was his only real master, and it demanded its due in sweat and muscle. He followed the creek home, its shallow water a silver ribbon over the stones. That's when he saw it. At first he thought it was just rags, laundry snagged in the brush, left by some careless traveler. But as he got closer, every muscle in his body went tight. 3 women, lying on the gravel bar like broken dolls. Their dresses were ripped, their skin a pale bruised map of cruelty under the cold sky. Dark hair matted to their faces, not one of them was moving. The crate of wood slid from his back and hit the ground with a dull thud. His first thought was the worst one. He was too late. He'd seen death in the war, seen it in his own bed when it stole Sarah. The sight still made the hair on his neck stand up. He knelt, his own breath catching in his throat. He pressed 2 rough fingers against the neck of the woman nearest to him, a pulse, faint, fluttering like a trapped bird, but it was there. He moved to the second. Same thing. The third, the smallest of them, had a breath that rattled in her chest, a sound that cut right through him. They were alive. Barely. Elias sat back on his heels, the sound of his own heart a drum in his ears. He looked back down the trail. Town was 5 miles away. 5 miles to get help, 5 miles back. By then, the cold would have finished its work. He had a choice: walk away and let fate have them, or carry a burden that might just break him. Damn it, he muttered, the words a cloud in the freezing air. His body screamed in protest. Every muscle was already worn to the bone from a day's labor. But the memory of Sarah's hand, cold in his, her breath fading in their quiet cabin, made the choice for him. He had sworn that day to her silent memory that he would never let someone else face the end alone if he could help it. He pulled off his heavy coat, spreading it over the smallest woman. He hooked his arms under the first, a woman with skin the color of polished bronze, and hauled her over his right shoulder. Her weight was a dead, crushing thing. He gritted his teeth and dragged the second woman over his left. His lungs burned. For the third, he emptied his wood crate, lined it with rags, and carefully lowered her inside. He cinched the straps tight, lifted the crate to his back, and pushed himself to his feet. The weight of 3 lives dragged him down. His legs shook, his vision swam, and his mind screamed at him to stop, to save himself. But he took a step, then another. The climb back was a nightmare. He fell once, hard on an icy patch, the weight driving him to his knee. For a long second he didn't think he could get up, but he pushed, his legs locking, and staggered on. By the time he saw his cabin through the trees, he was moving on pure will, half blind with exhaustion. He kicked the door open and laid them down one by one. On the bed, on the bench, on the rug, by the hearth. He bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. Then he lit the stove, the roar of the fire the first sign of hope in hours. He tore his own shirt into strips for bandages and set water to boil. He looked at them. 3 strangers, their fate now tangled with his. The silence in his cabin was gone, replaced by the weight of responsibility. Leaving them had never been an option. And now, he was about to find out that saving them was only the beginning of his troubles. As the stove's heat began to fight back the cold, Elias moved between the three women like a shadow. Their faces were a mess of cuts and bruises, their breathing shallow. He tore an old shirt into rags, dipped them in hot water, and began to clean their wounds. The smallest one whimpered when he touched her forehead, a sound that twisted something in his gut. It was the same sound Sarah had made in her last days. He paused, his jaw clenched tight, then forced himself to keep working. He wouldn't be helpless this time. Their dresses were torn, stiff with mud and frozen blood. But as he cleaned a wound on the arm of the first woman, the one with the bronze skin, his fingers brushed against something hard beneath the fabric of her sleeve. It was a small leather pouch, tied tightly to her wrist with a rawhide cord. It was hidden, deliberate. Curiosity gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Their survival came first. He draped his spare wool blankets over them, careful to preserve their modesty. He even pulled Sarah's old shawl from a chest and laid it over the woman with the pouch, her dark hair spilling over the worn fabric. Hours later, she was the first to wake. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and sharp, and fixed on him. He froze, a pot of broth in his hand. She looked around the cabin, her gaze taking in the rough walls, the single bed, the rifle mounted over the fireplace. Then she looked back at him. Her voice was a dry rasp. "Where?" "You're safe," Elias said, his own voice low and steady. He crouched beside her, offering a cup of broth. "Drink this." Her hand trembled when she tried to take it, so he held it to her lips. She drank, her eyes never leaving his face. He saw her gaze flicker to the torn sleeve of her dress, then to the blanket covering her. He adjusted it without a word, and she let him. After a few sips, her eyes closed again. The other two were still unconscious, but their breathing had evened out. Elias sat by the fire, his mind racing. Who were these women? And what was in that pouch? The secrecy of it felt dangerous. These weren't just women who had gotten lost in the woods. They were running from something. Or someone. When dawn broke, he stepped outside to split wood, needing the familiar rhythm of the axe to clear his head. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see figures watching from the shadows. He saw nothing. When he went back inside, the woman was awake again, propped up against the bedpost. "My name is Tala," she said, her voice stronger. She gestured to the others. "Sonny, Wren." Elias nodded. "Elias Boone." He offered her more broth. She took it, and this time her fingers brushed against his, a light, deliberate touch. She was testing him. He didn't pull away. After a moment, she asked the question that had been hanging in the air. "Why? Why what?" he asked. "Why didn't you leave us to die?" He could have given her a dozen reasons. Instead, he told her the simplest one. "Because you would have." Tala studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she said something that made the hair on his neck stand up again. "The men who came before you, they laughed." Elias felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. Later, while cleaning Tala's arm again, he hesitated, then pointed to the lump under her sleeve. "What is this?" he asked, his voice flat. Tala's eyes hardened. She didn't answer. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. She pulled her arm away, clutching the hidden pouch protectively. The message was clear. It was none of his business. But Elias knew better. Trouble had followed these women into his woods, and whatever was in that pouch was right at the heart of it. He had brought them into his home to save their lives. Now he was starting to realize he might have just invited death to his door. The tension in the cabin was as thick as the winter air outside. Elias moved with a new kind of caution, his eyes constantly flicking between the three women and the rifle on his wall. Tala watched his every move, her gaze sharp and suspicious. She said they had escaped from men who traded in drink and coin, but her fierce protection of that leather pouch told him there was more to the story. A lot more. He tried to ignore it. He focused on his work, tending to Sunny and Wren, who were slowly regaining consciousness. He fed them broth, cleaned their wounds, and kept the fire roaring. But the mystery of the pouch gnawed at him. One evening, while Tala was asleep, her arm lay limp by her side. The pouch was exposed. His hands itched to open it, to know what secret she was guarding so closely. He fought the urge. Prying into their secrets felt like a betrayal, even if it was for his own safety. He was their protector, not their jailer. The next day, a sound broke the stillness of the forest. Hoofbeats. A single rider. Elias grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding. He motioned for the women to stay quiet and out of sight. He opened the door a crack. It was Nate Finn, a trapper and trader from the nearest town. Nate was a talker, a man who traded in gossip as much as pelts. "Boone," Nate called out, his voice echoing in the clearing. "Been a while. Folks in town were starting to think a bear got you." Nate's eyes scanned the cabin, lingering on the smoke curling from the chimney. "Heard some strange talk," he continued, his voice dropping. "A posse passed through yesterday. Said they were hunting thieves, 3 Apache women who stole something valuable from the Black Creek gang." Elias's blood ran cold. The Black Creek gang, he knew the name. They were ruthless outlaws who ran a mining operation somewhere deep in the mountains, a place no one dared to go. They were killers, not simple traders of drink and coin. "Thieves?" Elias asked, keeping his voice steady. "What did they steal?" Nate shrugged. "A silver ingot, they said. A big one. There's a hefty bounty on their heads. Not for their return, Boone. For proof that they're dead." Elias felt the weight of the rifle in his hands. He was sheltering fugitives with a death sentence. "Haven't seen anyone," Elias said, his voice flat. "Just trees and snow." Nate eyed him for a long moment, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Well, if you do, you'd be wise to collect that bounty yourself. The Black Creek gang doesn't like loose ends." With a final nod, Nate turned his horse and rode away. Elias shut the door, his mind reeling. He turned to face Tala, who had heard every word. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's not just drink and coin, is it? It's silver, a bounty." Tala lifted her chin, her defiance unwavering. "We did not lie. We did what we had to do to survive." She finally reached down and untied the pouch from her wrist. She didn't hand it to him. She opened it herself, but it wasn't a silver ingot that she pulled out. It was a rolled-up piece of hide. She unrolled it on the table. It was a map, crude, drawn in charcoal, but detailed. It showed canyons, creeks, and a single marked location deep in the mountains. "This is the real prize," Tala said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "It's not an ingot they're after. It's this, the map to their mine." The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. He wasn't just hiding thieves. He was sitting on a secret that the most dangerous gang in the territory would kill for. He looked from the map to the 3 women. He had carried them from the brink of death, and in doing so, he had stepped into the middle of a war. The bounty wasn't the real threat. The real threat was that the Black Creek gang would never stop hunting them, not until they had the map back and all witnesses were silenced. Permanently. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The map lay on the table between them, a declaration of war drawn in charcoal. Elias stared at it, his mind trying to process the sheer scale of the danger he'd invited in. The Black Creek gang wasn't some ragtag bunch of drifters. They were a small army, and he was one man with one rifle. "A map," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You stole their whole operation." Tala met his gaze, her dark eyes unflinching. "They stole our lives first. They took us from our village, forced us to work in the dark, pulling their silver from the earth. Men died in that mine. Women, too. We weren't the first to be taken." She looked at her sisters, Sunny and Wren, who were now sitting up, listening, their faces etched with the same grim memory. "We are not sisters by blood," Tala admitted, another secret tumbling out. "We are the only three who survived the last cave-in. We bound ourselves together in that darkness. We are sisters in spirit, the only family we have left." The story hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Elias felt his anger toward her for lying evaporate, replaced by a cold, hard rage directed at the faceless men of the Black Creek Gang. He looked at the three women, at their haunted eyes and bruised skin, and he understood. They hadn't stolen for greed. They had stolen for justice. They were on their way to the federal marshal in the next territory, a 3-day ride if you had a horse and supplies. They had neither. They were trying to bring down an empire with nothing but a charcoal map and the will to survive. "The marshal won't come here," Elias said, thinking aloud. "Not before the gang does. Nate Finn's visit wasn't a coincidence. He was scouting for them. He knows." Tala nodded slowly. "We know, but we had nowhere else to run." The weight of their desperation settled on him. He had been their last hope, a random turn of fate by a frozen creek. Now, their fate was his. He walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered trees. He could tell them to leave. He could point them toward the marshal and wash his hands of it. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But the image of Sarah, pale and helpless, flashed in his mind again. He had been powerless to save her, but he wasn't powerless now. He turned back from the window, his decision made. He was a man who had chosen solitude, who had walled himself off from the world. But the world had come crashing through his door anyway. "They'll be back," he said, his voice firm. "Not just 1 or 2 riders. They'll send more." He picked up the map from the table and rolled it carefully. He looked at Tala. "You can't stay here." A flicker of fear crossed her face. "You are sending us away?" "No," Elias said, and the word surprised him with its certainty. "We can't stay here. The cabin is a target. Nate knows where it is." He looked around the small room, his mind working quickly. It was a death trap, but he knew these woods better than anyone. He knew caves and ravines the Black Creek Gang had never seen. "Get your strength," he said to the 3 of them. "Eat. Rest. We leave at dusk." "Leave? To where?" Sunny asked, her voice timid. Elias looked at the map in his hand, then at Tala. An idea, reckless and desperate, began to form in his mind. The gang wanted their map. They expected the women to run from it, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and that mine. They would be searching the trails leading away from the mountains. They wouldn't expect anyone to be crazy enough to run toward the danger. "They're hunting you," Elias said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "So we're going to stop running. We're going to hunt them." The women stared at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning hope. He had just turned their desperate flight into an attack. The lumberjack who wanted nothing to do with the world was about to declare war on its cruelest inhabitants. The plan was insane, born of desperation and a spark of vengeance. Elias knew it. But staying in the cabin was a death sentence. The Black Creek Gang would come, and they would come in force. Running toward their mine, into the heart of their territory, was the one thing they would never predict. As dusk settled, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Elias prepared. He packed dried meat, a tinderbox, and what little ammunition he had into a small sack. He gave Sarah's thickest wool coat to Tala and his spare blankets to Sunny and Wren. The women moved with a quiet, determined purpose, their earlier fear replaced by a fragile resolve. They were no longer just survivors. They were soldiers in a war they hadn't chosen. "The map shows a series of caves near the mine," Elias said, studying the charcoal lines by the firelight. "The gang uses them for storage, But there's a smaller passage here. He pointed to a faint line branching off. That leads up and away from the main complex. If we can get there, we can hide, watch them, learn their numbers, their routines. Tala nodded, her eyes fixed on the map. It is a place the guards avoid. They say it is haunted by the spirits of those who died in the tunnels. Good, Elias grunted. Let's hope they're scared of ghosts. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed his axe. It wasn't just a tool for cutting wood anymore. It was a weapon. They moved out under the cover of darkness, the moon a sliver of light in the ink-black sky. The cold was a physical thing, biting at any exposed skin. Elias led them, his steps sure-footed in the snow, breaking a trail for the women to follow. The forest was an alien landscape at night, full of strange shadows and unsettling noises. Every snap of a twig made them freeze. Every hoot of an owl sounded like a warning. They walked for hours, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing and the crunch of their boots in the snow. Sunny, the weakest of the three, began to stumble. Wren held her up, whispering words of encouragement. Elias saw Tala looking back at them, her face a mask of worry. He called a halt in a dense thicket of pines. Rest, he commanded, passing around a strip of jerky. Not for long. As they sat huddled together for warmth, a low sound drifted through the trees. A wolf's howl. But then another answered, and another. It wasn't a pack of wolves. It was a signal. Men. On their trail already. Elias's gut tightened. They found the cabin empty, he whispered. They're casting a net. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at him. He had underestimated how quickly they would move. They had to go faster. They pushed on, their exhaustion a dull ache that threatened to overwhelm them. Just before dawn, as the sky began to lighten to a bruised purple, Elias saw it. A dark shape against the snow-covered ridge. The entrance to the caves. It was a gaping maw in the mountainside, a place that reeked of stale air and old sorrows. As they drew closer, they saw tracks in the snow. Heavy boots, a lot of them. They had company. Elias held up a hand, motioning for them to get down. He crept forward, peering around a rock outcropping. Two men stood guard at the cave entrance, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were heavily armed, their rifles held at the ready. Getting past them would be impossible. The plan had failed before it had even begun. They were trapped, with the gang's trackers closing in from behind and two armed guards in front. Just as despair began to set in, Tala grabbed his arm. She pointed not at the main entrance, but to a spot 50 yards to the left, almost completely hidden by a snowdrift and a cluster of young pines. It was a crack in the rock face, no wider than a man's shoulders. It wasn't on the map. There, she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. A ventilation shaft. The old ones. They sealed the main entrance, but sometimes the rock shifts. We used to feel the wind from it deep in the tunnels. It was a sliver of a chance, a literal crack in the enemy's fortress. But it was their only way in. The trackers' howls echoed again, closer this time. They were out of time. They had to move, and they had to move now. The choice was simple. Face the hunters in the open, or crawl into the guts of the mountain and pray they didn't get buried alive. The ventilation shaft was a tight squeeze. Elias went first, his broad shoulders scraping against the rock. The air inside was freezing and smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly bitter. The smell of the mine. He reached back, pulling Tala through after him. Sunny and Wren followed, their movements clumsy with fear and exhaustion. The shaft opened into a narrow tunnel, pitch black and silent as a tomb. Elias struck a spark from his tinderbox, lighting a small makeshift torch, a piece of cloth wrapped around a stick and soaked in the little lamp oil he'd brought. The flickering light cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the oppressive silence. "This way," Tala whispered, her voice barely audible. She took the lead, her memory of the tunnels their only guide. The map was useless in this labyrinth. They moved deeper into the mountain, the air growing colder, the silence more profound. It felt like they were being swallowed alive. After what felt like an eternity, Tala stopped. "We are close to the main storage cave," she breathed. "The guards will be near." Elias extinguished the torch. The sudden darkness was absolute, disorienting. He could hear the faint scuff of boots on stone from somewhere ahead. He put a hand on Tala's shoulder, a silent command to wait. They stood there, barely breathing, listening. A low murmur of voices drifted down the tunnel. Two men talking, complaining about the cold, about their commander, a man they called Cutter. "Cutter's gone mad since those women escaped," one of the voices grumbled, "tearing the whole mountain apart looking for that map." "It's not the map he's worried about," the other voice replied, and what he said next made Elias's blood turn to ice. "It's what the oldest one, Tala, knows. She was a translator. She saw the ledger." "The ledger?" the first man asked. "What ledger?" The second man chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "The one where Cutter writes down the names of the big men back east he sells his silver to. Judges, senators, army colonels. That's the real treasure. That map is just paper. Her memory. That could bring them all down." The truth hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. This was never just about a silver mine. It was a massive conspiracy, reaching the highest levels of power. Tala wasn't just a survivor. She was the star witness in a crime that could shake the nation. And Cutter, the leader of the Black Creek gang, didn't just want her silenced. He needed her erased. Suddenly, a new sound echoed down the tunnel. A sharp, metallic click. The sound of a rifle hammer being cocked. And it came from the darkness behind them. A voice, cold and steady, cut through the silence. "Drop the rifle, Lumberjack, and don't even think about turning around." They hadn't been followed. They had walked right into a trap. The voice from the darkness belonged to a man who stepped into the faint light filtering from the main cave. He was lean and wiry, his face scarred, his eyes cold and empty. He held a rifle leveled at Elias's back. It wasn't one of the guards. This was someone different. A hunter. "Cutter will be pleased," the man said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "He sent me to sweep the old tunnels. Didn't expect to find the rats had come back to the nest." Elias's mind raced. He was caught, his own rifle useless. Tala and the others were huddled behind him, trapped. Any sudden move, and they were all dead. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice a low growl. "They call me Silas," the man said. "I'm the one they send when a problem needs to disappear. And you, my friend, are a very big problem." Just then, one of the guards from the main cave wandered back, drawn by the sound of voices. "Silas, what is it? Did you find something?" His eyes widened as he saw Elias and the women. He started to raise his rifle. It was the opening Elias needed. He wasn't a soldier or a gunslinger, but he was a lumberjack. His body was a machine built for explosive power. He dropped his shoulder and pivoted, swinging his own rifle like a club. The heavy stock connected with the guard's jaw with a sickening crunch. The man went down without a sound. At the same instant, Silas fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, but in that split second, Tala had acted. She shoved Elias hard, sending him stumbling to the side. The bullet that was meant for his heart tore through the flesh of his upper arm instead. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through him. He fell to his knees, his rifle clattering on the stone floor. Silas smiled, raising his rifle for the killing shot. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had focused on Elias, the man he perceived as the only threat. He had forgotten about the women. With a cry that was part rage and part grief, Wren, the quietest of the three, lunged out of the darkness. She wasn't armed. She was just a blur of motion, a desperate protective fury. She slammed into Silas's legs, knocking him off balance. His second shot went wide, ricocheting off the tunnel ceiling. Before he could recover, Sonny was there, grabbing the rifle barrel and wrenching it with surprising strength. The balance of power shifted in a heartbeat. It wasn't one man against a hunter anymore. It was three survivors fighting with the ferocity of cornered animals. And then there was Tala. She hadn't lunged. She hadn't screamed. She had picked up a loose rock from the tunnel floor. As Silas struggled with Sonny, trying to bring the rifle back around, Tala stepped forward and brought the rock down on the back of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence descended on the tunnel again, broken only by their ragged gasps and the drip of water, and the drip of blood from Elias's arm. Tala rushed to his side, tearing a strip of cloth from her dress to staunch the bleeding. "The ledger!" Elias gritted out, the pain making his vision swim. "He said you saw a ledger." Tala's face was grim in the dim light. "I did," she whispered. "I read them the names, I memorized them all." The stakes had just been raised to an impossible level. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about exposing a rot that went to the very top. But to do that, they had to get out of this mountain alive. And now the entire gang knew exactly where they were. The gunshot would have echoed through the entire mine. They could hear the shouts now, the sound of heavy boots running toward them. They were deep inside enemy territory, wounded, and the whole army was coming for them. The shouts grew louder, echoing down the labyrinthine tunnels. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the full force of the Black Creek gang descended on them. Elias gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his arm as Tala tightened the makeshift bandage. "We can't go back the way we came," he gasped. "We have to go deeper." "There is a way," Tala said, her voice urgent. She pointed down a dark, narrow passage they hadn't noticed before. "Another ventilation shaft. It leads to the surface on the far side of the ridge. It's a steep climb, but it's our only chance." She looked at the two unconscious men on the ground. "We need their guns." They worked quickly, their movements frantic. Elias, fighting off waves of dizziness, took Silas's rifle and ammunition belt. Tala took the guard's pistol. They left the men in the darkness and plunged into the narrow passage. The shaft was a brutal, near-vertical climb up a chimney of rock. It was dark, cramped, and slick with moisture. They clawed their way upward, finding handholds and footholds in the rough-hewn stone. Elias, with only one good arm, struggled badly. The pain was a constant, throbbing fire, and his grip was failing. Twice, he felt himself start to slip. And twice, Tala, climbing just below him, braced his boot with her shoulder, her strength a silent, stubborn anchor. Behind them, they could hear the gang entering the tunnel system, their voices bouncing off the walls, getting closer. "Spread out! Check every passage! Cutter wants them alive!" one man bellowed. The words sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through Elias. Alive. They wanted Tala's memory, not her body. After a climb that shredded their hands and strained every muscle to its breaking point, they saw it. A faint circle of gray light far above them. The surface. With a final, desperate push, Elias hauled himself over the ledge, collapsing onto a snow-covered outcrop. The cold, clean air was a shock to his lungs after the stale darkness of the mine. One by one, the women followed, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, their chests heaving. They were on the desolate, wind-swept back of the mountain. Below them, the forest stretched out like a dark, rolling sea. They were out, but they weren't safe. They looked back and saw the main entrance to the mine, a quarter-mile away across a rocky plateau. Men were already pouring out, fanning out across the landscape, their dark figures stark against the white snow. The hunt had begun in earnest. "We can't outrun them," Wren whispered, her voice trembling. "Not in the open." Elias scanned the terrain, his mind sharp despite the pain. The gang was focused on the downward slopes, expecting them to run for the cover of the timberline. But to their left, the ridge climbed even higher, toward a jagged peak of bare rock and ice. It was a treacherous, exposed route, and it was the last place they would be expected to go. "We go up," Elias said, his voice raw. "They think we're running down, away from the mine. We go up, over the peak. We can circle back through the high country." It was a gamble. A blizzard was brewing in the west, dark clouds piling up on the horizon. If they got caught on that peak when the storm hit, they would freeze to death. But it was a better death than the one Cutter had planned for them. They started climbing again, the wind whipping at them, trying to tear them from the mountainside. The gang's shouts faded behind them as they clawed their way higher. The world became a blur of snow, ice, and burning lungs. Elias's wounded arm was a dead weight, the pain a nauseating, constant companion. He moved on pure instinct, his will locked on the single goal of getting Tala and her sisters to safety. As they neared the summit, the first flakes of snow began to fall. The storm was coming faster than he'd thought. They crested the peak and started down the other side, a steep, treacherous slope of scree and ice. Below them, the terrain was a chaotic jumble of canyons and ravines. It was a place a man could disappear forever. Suddenly, a voice cut through the wind. "There!" It was one of the trackers, a man with the eyes of a hawk. He was on a ledge below them, not more than 100 yards away. He had circled around, anticipating their move. He raised his rifle. Elias reacted without thinking. He shoved Tala and the others behind a rock and brought up Silas's rifle. He was a woodsman, not a marksman, and his left arm, his shooting arm, was on fire. He rested the barrel on the rock to steady it, took a breath, and fired. The tracker fired at the same time. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound. Elias felt a bullet tear through the sleeve of his coat, grazing his ribs. It felt like being kicked by a mule, but his own shot had flown true. The tracker staggered back, a look of surprise on his face, before tumbling from the ledge and disappearing into the abyss below. The immediate threat was gone. But the shot would act as a beacon, guiding the rest of the gang directly to them. The storm was closing in, the snowfall becoming a blinding curtain of white. They were wounded, exposed, and the hunters were closing the distance. They had escaped the mountain only to find themselves trapped on its unforgiving peak. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a screaming vortex of wind and snow. Visibility dropped to 0. They couldn't see the path ahead, couldn't see the hunters behind them. The cold was a living thing, seeping through their clothes, stealing the heat from their bodies. "This way!" Elias yelled over the roar of the wind, grabbing Tala's hand. He led them blindly, relying on his woodsman's instinct, his internal compass honed by years of solitude. He knew they had to get below the tree line, to find some kind of shelter before the cold finished them off. The gunshot that had saved them had also doomed them. A single loud announcement of their location. Now, it was a race between the gang and the storm. They stumbled down the treacherous slope, half sliding, half falling. Elias's wounded arm was numb, a throbbing deadness he could barely feel anymore. He was losing blood, and the cold was making him clumsy, his thoughts slow. He knew they were fading. Sunny had fallen twice, and Wren was practically carrying her. Tala was the only one who seemed to draw strength from the chaos, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a relentless fire. Just when Elias thought they could go no further, he smelled it. Wood smoke. Faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was there. He stopped, sniffing the air like an animal. Someone else was out here. Shelter. Hope surged through him, a warm current in his freezing veins. He pushed them forward, following the scent. They broke through a line of snow-laden pines and saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin, barely more than a shack, nestled in a small ravine. A thin tendril of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile beacon in the blizzard. The promise of warmth and safety was so powerful it was almost painful. But as they got closer, Elias's hope turned to ice. There were fresh tracks in the snow around the cabin. Not just one man, several, and tied to a tree was a horse he recognized. It belonged to Nate Finn, the traitor. The traitor. It was a trap. Nate had led Cutter's men here, to this hunting shack, to wait for them. They had predicted his route over the mountain. He had led the women from one prison straight into another. "No," Tala breathed beside him, her face ashen. The warmth of the cabin was a lie, a cruel illusion hiding the death that waited inside. They backed away, trying to melt back into the trees, but it was too late. The cabin door creaked open. A man stepped out, a hulking figure in a heavy fur coat. He wasn't Nate. This man was bigger, his face a roadmap of scars, a thick, dark beard covering the lower half of his face. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, his eyes scanning the storm. This had to be Cutter. He hadn't seen them yet, but he would. They were trapped. The ravine offered no escape. Behind them was the open mountainside, and in front of them was the man who wanted them erased. Elias raised his rifle, his hands shaking from cold and blood loss. He could try a shot, but he knew his aim was shot. He would miss, and then it would be over. Inside the cabin, a voice called out. "Anything, boss?" It was Nate Finn. "Nothing but this damn storm," Cutter growled back. "But they're out here. I can feel it. They'll get desperate for shelter soon enough, and we'll be waiting." He turned to go back inside. In that moment, as Cutter's back was to them, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. A low, guttural snarl. It didn't come from the cabin, it came from the rocks above them. Elias looked up. A massive shape was perched on an overhanging ledge, a creature of shadow and fury. A mountain lion, its golden eyes fixed on Cutter. The storm must have driven it down from the high peaks in search of shelter. The ravine was its territory, and it saw the men in the cabin as intruders. With a scream that was half roar, half shriek, the cougar launched itself from the ledge. It hit Cutter with the force of a freight train, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. The rifle flew from Cutter's hand as he went down, his own screams of terror and agony swallowed by the blizzard. The cabin door flew open. Nate Finn and two other gang members rushed out, their faces a mask of confusion and horror. They saw their leader being torn apart and started firing wildly into the swirling snow. It was chaos, a bloody, brutal, and completely unexpected diversion. "Now!" Elias yelled, shoving the women away from the cabin back toward the relative safety of the trees. "Run!" They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled away, the sounds of the fight, the gunshots, the screaming of men, the unearthly shrieks of the cat, fading behind them. They had been saved, not by a plan or a prayer, but by the raw, untamed violence of the wilderness itself. They were still lost, still freezing, but they were alive. And for the first time, their enemies were just as lost and terrified as they were. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, collapsing in a heap in the meager shelter of a rock outcropping. The sounds of the fight had faded, lost to the blizzard's roar. For a long moment, they could do nothing but gasp for air, their bodies trembling with cold and the aftermath of terror. Cutter was dead. Elias was sure of it. No man could survive an attack like that, but Nate Finn and the others were still out there, and they would be furious. Elias knew the reprieve was temporary. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. The wound in his arm had started bleeding again, a dark stain spreading across the snow. He was getting weaker, his vision starting to blur at the edges. "We have to keep moving," he slurred, his words thick. Tala was at his side instantly, her face a mask of grim determination. "You can't," she said, her voice firm. "You've lost too much blood. We need to find shelter. Real shelter." She looked at her sisters. They were huddled together, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They were at their limit. Pushing them further into the storm would be a death sentence. It was Tala who took charge. Her eyes, accustomed to the darkness of the mine, scanned the surrounding rock face with an intensity that belied her own exhaustion. "There," she said, pointing to a dark line at the base of the cliff, almost completely obscured by a snowdrift. "A fissure. It might lead to a cave." With their last reserves of strength, they clawed through the snowdrift. The fissure was narrow, but it opened into a small, dry cave, no bigger than Elias's cabin, but it was shielded from the wind. It was a haven. They collapsed inside, the sudden silence and stillness a jarring contrast to the chaos outside. Sunny and Wren fell into an exhausted sleep almost immediately. Elias slumped against the wall, the last of his strength gone. The world was tilting, the darkness at the edges of his vision closing in. "Elias!" Tala's voice seemed to come from a great distance. She was holding his face in her hands, her touch surprisingly warm. "Stay with me." She tore a larger strip of cloth from her dress and began to work on his wound, her movements deft and practiced. She cleaned it with snow, her touch gentle but firm, then bound it tightly. "You need fire," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She found the tinderbox in his pack. Her hands were shaking, but she managed to strike a spark, nursing it into a tiny flame with dried moss she scraped from the rock. Soon, a small, precious fire was crackling in the center of the cave, pushing back the oppressive cold. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. He was aware of Tala moving around the cave, of her checking on her sisters, of her sitting beside him, her hand resting on his forehead. He was trapped in a fever dream, images flashing through his mind. Sarah's face, the flash of the mountain lion, the cold, dead eyes of the tracker he had shot. He had killed a man. The thought settled in his gut like a cold stone. He had taken a life to protect them. He woke hours later. The storm had lessened, its roar softened to a low moan. The fire was a steady, comforting glow. Tala was sitting by the entrance, the pistol they had taken from the guard resting on her lap. She was standing watch. She turned as she heard him stir, and a wave of relief washed over her face. "You are awake." "How long?" he croaked, his throat raw. "Most of the night," she replied. She brought him a cup of melted snow. He drank greedily. "The gang?" he asked. "I have heard nothing," she said. "The storm is too thick. They are either dead or hunkered down like us." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The shared ordeal had stripped away all pretense. There were no more secrets between them. "The ledger," Elias said finally, his voice stronger. "The names you memorized. You still plan to go to the marshal?" Tala looked into the fire, her expression thoughtful. "Cutter is dead. The gang is broken, scattered. Nate Finn is a coward. He will run. The threat to us is likely gone." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "But the men on that list, they are not. They are still out there, in their fine houses, with their power. They will hear what happened here. They will worry. And they might send someone else to clean up the loose ends, someone worse than Cutter." The chilling truth of her words settled over him. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. They hadn't just angered a gang of outlaws. They had threatened a conspiracy. "So what do we do?" he asked. Tala reached out and took his good hand. Her grip was strong, steady. "First, we survive this winter," she said. "Then, we decide. Together." The word hung in the air. Together. It was a promise. They were no longer a lumberjack and 3 refugees. They were a unit, forged in violence and ice, a family. As the storm finally began to break, a pale dawn light filtering into the cave, Elias looked at Tala and her sisters, sleeping peacefully by the fire. He had stepped into a fight that wasn't his. He had killed for them, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would do it all again. Their war was now his war, and he would see it through to the end. The days that followed were a blur of survival. The storm passed, leaving the world buried in a pristine, deadly silence. They stayed in the cave, their small fire a fragile bastion against the immense cold. Elias's fever broke, and slowly, with Tala's relentless care, his strength began to return. She hunted small game with the pistol, her aim surprisingly steady, while Sunny and Wren gathered what dry wood they could find. They worked as a team, their movements efficient, their words few. They didn't need to speak. They understood each other on a level deeper than language. One morning, Elias was strong enough to walk to the cave entrance and look out over the valley. The air was clean and sharp. There was no sign of the gang, no tracks, no smoke. It was as if they had been erased by the storm. He knew some of them, like Nate Finn, had likely survived, but they were scattered, leaderless. The immediate danger was gone. "We cannot stay here forever," Tala said, coming to stand beside him. "The food will run out." "My cabin," Elias said. "If it's still standing, it's a day's walk from here. It has supplies." The thought of his home, of its solid walls and warm stove, was a powerful pull. It represented a life he thought he had lost forever. It was a risk. Some of the gang might have gone back there, hoping to ambush them. But it was a risk they had to take. They made the journey 2 days later, moving cautiously through the snow-filled forest. Elias carried the rifle, his senses on high alert. Tala walked beside him, the pistol tucked into her belt. The woods were quiet, peaceful. It was hard to believe such violence had occurred here only days ago. They found the cabin untouched. It was cold and silent, but it was safe. As Elias lit the stove, a profound sense of relief washed over him. He was home. In the weeks that followed, a new routine settled over them. They were no longer just surviving. They were living. Elias taught the women the ways of the forest, how to set snares, how to read the tracks in the snow. In return, they brought life back into his silent cabin. Sunny, it turned out, had a gift for cooking, turning their meager supplies into savory stews. Wren had a quiet, calming presence, her gentle humming filling the corners of the small room. And Tala was his shadow. They worked together, chopping wood, repairing the cabin walls, their hands often brushing, their glances lingering. The walls that Elias had built around his heart began to crumble. He found himself laughing, a sound he hadn't heard from his own lips in years. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sunny and Wren asleep on their blankets, Tala spoke the words that had been lying unspoken between them. "The ledger," she said softly. "The names. I have not forgotten them." Elias looked at her. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, was beautiful. The bruises had faded, but a new strength had taken their place. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "If I go to the marshal," she said, "I become a target for the rest of my life. These men are powerful. They will never stop hunting me. They will never stop hunting anyone associated with me." She looked at Sunny and Wren. "Or my sisters." The weight of her choice settled on him. She held the power to expose a massive web of corruption, but the cost would be her own peace, her own safety. It was an impossible burden. "But if I do nothing," she continued, her voice hardening, "then they win. All the people who died in that mine. Their deaths mean nothing. The men on that list will continue to build their fortunes on the backs of others." Elias reached out and took her hand. "You don't have to decide alone." He thought for a long moment, the fire crackling in the silence. He thought of the life he had lost, and the new life that had been given to him. He thought of the promise he had made to Sarah's memory. "There is another way," he said slowly. "The marshal represents the law, but sometimes the law is too slow, too clean. These men don't fear the law. They own it, but they fear exposure. They fear chaos. An idea, bold and dangerous, began to take shape. "You write the names down," he said. "All of them. You write down everything you know about the mine, about the silver, about who it was sold to. We make copies, dozens of them, and we don't send them to one marshal. We send them to every newspaper, every territorial governor, every senator who isn't on that list. We don't light a candle, we start a wildfire." A slow smile spread across Tala's face. It was a brilliant, reckless plan. It would turn her from a single witness into an anonymous, unstoppable force. She would be a ghost, her story spreading across the country, turning the powerful men against each other as they scrambled to cover their tracks. It was justice, delivered not by a courtroom, but by ink and paper. It was a lumberjack's justice, simple, direct, and devastating. The next morning, they began. Tala dictated, her memory flawless, and Elias wrote, his rough hand carefully forming each letter. They created a document that would tear the lid off a nationwide conspiracy. As he wrote, he knew that their quiet life was over. They had faced the storm and the gang, but now they were picking a fight with giants. But looking at Tala, at her fierce, unbreakable spirit, he knew they would face this new battle the same way they had faced all the others. Together. Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing the forest back to life. The cabin was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. They had spent the last month preparing. Elias had made 2 trips to different towns, miles apart, mailing thick envelopes to dozens of addresses across the country. He never used the same post office twice. He was a ghost, delivering Tala's vengeance. They didn't know if it would work. They could only wait. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Elias cleared a small patch of land for a garden. Sonny and Wren planted seeds they had found in his stores. Tala learned to use his rifle, her aim becoming as steady as his own. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a home. The hole in Elias's heart, left by Sarah's death, had been filled. One afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a gang member. It was a circuit marshal, his badge glinting in the sun. Elias's heart leaped into his throat. He stepped out of the cabin, rifle in hand, with Tala right behind him. "Elias Boone?" the marshal asked, his eyes wary. Elias nodded. There's a storm brewing back east," the marshal said, his voice full of disbelief. "Stories appearing in the papers, about senators, judges, about a secret silver mine. The stories mention a witness, an Apache woman. They say she was last seen in these mountains." Elias kept his face a mask of stone. "Haven't seen anyone," he said, the old lie coming easily to his lips. The marshal stared at him, then at Tala, whose face was unreadable. He saw the rifle in Elias's hands, the pistol on Tala's hip. He saw the quiet strength in their eyes. He wasn't a fool. He knew he had found what he was looking for. But he also saw something else. He saw 2 people who had been through hell and had come out the other side, ready to defend their small piece of peace. The marshal hesitated, then slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "Right," he said. "Figured as much. Just chasing rumors." He tipped his hat. "You folks have a good day." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. It was over. The wildfire had started. The men on the list would be investigated, their careers ruined, their conspiracy dismantled from within by panic and betrayal, and the source would remain a ghost, a rumor in the mountains. Tala stepped forward and slid her hand into Elias's. He looked down at her, at the woman he had pulled from a frozen creek, the woman who had fought beside him, who had saved his life. He looked at Sonny and Wren, tending the new garden, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. He had found them by accident. But they had saved him on purpose. They had given him a reason to live again, not in solitude, but in the warmth of a family he never expected to have. The silence that had once been his shield was now filled with life. His lonely cabin was now a home, built not just of wood, but of courage, survival, and a love that had grown in the harshest of winters. He pulled Tala close, the forest that had almost been their tomb, now a testament to their new beginning. The past was a ghost, but the future was a garden waiting to be tended. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the edge of the wild. Thanks for watching.